You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. This week's guest features somebody whose post-military career work with veterans may be as, if not more important than his military career itself. We'll get to him in just a moment. Our normal set of announcements. Please continue to follow us on all the social media sites. Help grow the social media grow the following. That's what I want to say. Help grow. We need more people. Hazard Ground, at Hazard Ground Podcast, both of them are where you find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Make sure you guys follow us there. Keep up with the show. We love interacting with you guys there as well. Feel free to give us comments and guest suggestions there. If you want to do guest suggestions, you can always email us at producer@hazardground.com, and we'll take them there as well. Make sure you guys remember our promotion with Amazon. You go to our website, hazardground.com, click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage, or under the sponsors tab, it'll redirect you to Amazon. You can do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we donate a percentage of that back to some of the great charities and organizations featured here on the Hazard Ground, like the one you're going to hear about coming up today that I have intimately been involved with at one point in my career as well. Apple reviews. Need them, love them, keep them coming. Wherever you guys get these podcasts, give us an Apple review. Tell us why you love the show. Give us 5 stars, and we continue to grow the show that way as well. On to this week's guest, who spent 26 years in the United States Army, retired as a colonel. He had 2 combat deployments, one to the Gulf War and then one in the invasion in Iraq. In his post-military career, he was the chief executive officer of the Veterans Outreach Center, and he currently works as the CEO of the Headstrong Project, which is one of the better and more notable veterans organizations out there. He is Jim McDonough, joining us here on the Hazard Ground. Jim, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Mark, thank you very much. And thanks for that plug for the organization.
Headstrong is an organization I'm intimately familiar with. Several of my friends have been tied to it, including Garrett Cathcart, Miguel Acevedo. As you know, it works for you guys currently. I've had many conversations with him. This is a fantastic organization dedicated to dealing with the mental trauma and mental wounds that veterans have dealt with in the post-9/11 war and global war on terror. So it's one of those organizations that gets right at the heart of some of the biggest problems plaguing veterans today. So plenty more on them as we get through this whole thing, because it's quite the rise in your post-military career and what you've done with veterans that has been incredibly beneficial and certainly something that we're all thankful for. But all that said, back at the beginning, I don't want to date you too much, but it was way before 9/11 that you got in the military. So how and when and where did it start?
Yeah, so I'm a son of a New York State trooper and a registered nurse who put himself through college and graduated from college and walked into an Army recruiter's office in upstate New York and enlisted in the Army for the officer candidate school option. So bounced out of college, went right into the Army officer candidate school. And I'll date myself, Mark, for your listeners. It was 1982. So I sound like an old guy, but I actually don't feel it. I'll just tell you that. So yeah, it was just a really good ride into the Army. Very enjoyable career.
And it's interesting, that time frame was very sort of post-Vietnam, drag, the military was looked down upon. Did you get sort of, I guess, frowned upon for making that decision?
I think I was an outlier, I'll be honest with you, but my uncle served in Vietnam. My dad was a Marine in the Korean War. I grew up as a kid playing Army in the woods. So for me, it's what I wanted to do. I also grew up in the shadows of a SAC base, a Strategic Air Command Air Force base at the height of the Cold War. So, and the guys I went to high school with, their dads were pilots who came back from Vietnam, some prisoners of war. So, when I hung out at their house with my friends from high school, for me, it was natural to go in. But the guys around me, I only had one guy who went in with me. He went into the 82nd as an artilleryman, and we both walked into the recruiter at the same time. It was only the 2 of us. So, yeah, it was a little strange, I think, but it was, you got to remember, it was thick of the Cold War, which, for those who have been around for a day or two, it was a pretty serious time, in the world. And I gravitated towards it, Mark. For me, it was a natural fit.
Strangely, here we are again. Not so Cold War, a little bit more warm, but
No,
it's come full circle. So, did you know what you wanted to do when you enlisted? Did you know what you wanted to do in the Army? You just sort of were winging it.
Yeah, well, I wasn't winging it. So, Norwich University in Vermont was where the Army in the day produced tankers. That was where you went to become an armor officer, and I really thought I was going to go into armor. And then you meet guys in the Army. Meet guys in, and they're like, this isn't a bad branch. So fortunately for me, I finished high enough at OCS, I could pick what I wanted to do. And I picked, believe it or not, air defense artillery, small branch, very technical, and to be honest, Mark, it had some unbelievable duty assignments. Holland, places like, you'd never get to as a kid from New York State. I ended up in a place in then West Germany that wasn't even on the map. In the middle of the woods on a Hawk site, a Hawk weapon system. And it was, it was pretty freaking intense, to be honest. Like, we were manning a fully capable missile system that could shoot down enemy planes on a 20-minute notice. So the pucker factor was pretty real. I was situated across from the East German border. I served on then the East German border, which was a big deal in the Fulda Gap. That was a term some of your listeners may remember, many won't. But at the time, at the height of the Cold War, it was the tip of where war was going to break out. Yeah. 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment was my regiment. Now the Op Fort, the National Training Center, the old 11th ACR was a storied unit from Vietnam. And to your point about like when I went in, like most of the guys I went in with, the salty NCOs, and some of the guys who've been rifted as officers and became NCOs at the end of Vietnam, those are my leaders when I first came in the Army. And it was a wild time because, Jesus, I served with some guys who were like grizzled from Vietnam. I had a first platoon sergeant first class, Rowdy Yates, crazy Vietnam veteran as there ever was, but what a terrific NCO. Like, knew how to push soldiers the right way, knew how to train a brand new lieutenant. And I feel like back in the day, serving with guys who served in Vietnam was a blessing because they'd been there and they helped you really focus like on your shit, not to be crude, but
no, you're fine.
They paid attention to like, look, you need to get your ass straight. We'll keep our ass straight. And this will work best if you focus on the things that take care of us. So for me, the introduction to the Army was full of Vietnam veterans. My first day on the site I was assigned to in the woods, I walked through the gate shack and there were bullet holes in the gate shack from the battery commander kind of discharging his sidearm in the gate shack. He got pissed off at the gate guard. He was a Vietnam veteran, and that's how wild it was. It was the Wild West. And so, I look back on it fondly, but I grew up with a lot of guys who served in Vietnam, and they kind of taught me the ropes in the Army.
Yeah, discharging your weapon today at a gate shack might result in some paperwork in the military. That
didn't even back then, Mark.
Just spitballing that there might be some headaches that result from that. Different times, obviously. Yeah.
Very different.
I mean, listen, I still tell the story. I remember one time my platoon sergeant as a lieutenant, like literally smacked the crap out of an E5 who just was screwing up left and right. And I watched the whole thing happen. I just said, I'm going to step outside. You guys take care of this NCO business. I'll be outside if you need anything. I don't know what happened after that.
Exactly.
All I know is he didn't screw up after that. So we don't. We're kind of the gentler Army nowadays, Jim. So things have
very
changed.
different.
Yeah, to say the least. Was there any point in this early on in this experience where you thought that maybe you had made a wrong decision? You were just going to get out after 4 years, there
was a brief period when everybody was talking to me about that very point, Mark. Like it was, but I'll tell you, I was in love with it. Like I fell in love with it immediately. Like for me, like being around soldiers was like a life, dream, just to be around normal guys serving their country. So I dug in while everybody else went to Cameron Brooks and all these other headhunter firms and got out. I loved it, and I felt like I was pretty good at it. So I was like, why give up on something you're good and passionate about? And so I really didn't give it much thought. And it was only once in those 26 years that actually thought about it. And it was that first tour of duty in Germany. I didn't really think that hard about it. Mm-hmm. I really didn't. I liked it. I was having a good time. Who gets to live in Germany as a 22-year-old, and be around some knuckleheads from all over the country who just come together to try to do the right thing every day. So
yeah,
we had our share of problems. There were Jesus, that's back in the day when drugs were, really on the increase. I was in West Germany. Hashish was big. So I still remember a story. General Fred Franks was then Colonel Fred Franks, famed Vietnam veteran, lost a leg in Vietnam. He was regimental commander of the 11th ACR, and he had field grade UCMJ authority over our soldiers. I remember marching my platoon to an Article 15 hearing with General Franks. And in his office, he just rapid fired, removed sergeant stripes, threw them in the trash can for drugs. I mean, we must have busted that day on a unit year analysis. It must have caught 10 guys in my platoon back in the day. Yeah, you'd be on site, guys would be smoking hash in crumpled Pepsi cans in the middle of the night. That was the Army in 1982. So
that's crazy.
It was in the middle of cleaning up a lot.
Were you still part of the 2-beer lunch rule or the 3-beer? Were you around? Or was that before you?
Some places, Grafenbier was a little bit like that. Big training center in Germany. There were those things. One of my buddies who was a first lieutenant, I can tell this story. He got nailed for it. He used to come to work with a thermos full of White Russians. And everybody thought it was coffee, but it was White Russians. So it was a little bit like the Wild West, Mark, back then. And then the Army slowly started cleaning itself up, starting then. It was the post-Vietnam period, and there was a lot of cleanup to be done. Drugs have become a big problem in the Army in those days. Huge.
Crazy. So as you finish up in Germany, what's next? I mean, how long are you there for, and what's your next assignment?
So, for me, I went to the captain's career course. Okay. I went back and I volunteered to go right back to Germany. So I did a turn and burn. I did about 7 months in the United States for the captain's career course, Fort Bliss, Texas. Had our first child, and went right back to Germany. Because at that time, what's next for me, Mark, was the Army was fielding its big 5 weapon systems, M1 Abrams tank, Apache helicopter, and the Patriot missile system. So I went right back into battery command of a Patriot missile battery, 1st Battalion to land in Germany at the time, 438A. I commanded Alpha Battery for almost 3 years. For me, which was unprecedented. Most guys get to command 18, 24 months. I stuck in command for almost 3 years in that battery. And man, it was great. It was living large, brand new weapon system. Kind of dominating the landscape of air and missile defense at the time. And I was in one of the first batteries in where it really mattered and in command. So I had a great time.
Did you think as you were going through this, did you have a plan of where you wanted to go next and what you wanted to do? And obviously, the Cold War is actually starting to wind down at this point in time.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because when I left Germany the second time, the wall had come down.
Right.
So I was in the middle of the waning days of the Cold War. But Mark, to your question, no, I'm not a guy with like some spreadsheet with life goals on it. I just enjoy, and believe me, I served with officers like that drove me up the wall, that had marks on a calendar when they needed to be somewhere, and never really respected that way of life, to be perfectly honest. No, I actually loved what I was doing when I was doing it, and I kind of felt like I was pretty good at it, and the organization would take care of me because of that. Maybe a bit naive, but I've been a lucky guy, I guess, Mark. I don't know any other way to say it. I did not have a life plan. I just believed in serving, and I loved it, and I loved the people I was around and taking care of soldiers, and it seemed to be natural for me to just keep going in that direction. But I didn't plot a course. I didn't want to be somewhere by some date. I just liked what I was doing.
Well, you had the serious threat of military action during the Cold War. It never comes to fruition. However, we flipped the calendar to, late 1990, early 1991, and Desert Shield is underway. Desert Storm is about to happen. Like, where are you, and what are you thinking and feeling about all this, given what you had dealt with already?
So when the first Gulf War kicked off, I was sitting in what the Army called advanced civil schooling. They sent me to grad school to get an advanced degree. So I was at Indiana State University getting an advanced degree in communications, and when the war broke out. And after, as I finished my first master's degree, I had to pay it back. So the Army sent me to the Pentagon to kind of pay that back. And, I skipped over a couple of short tours in there, but the next major milestone for me after advanced civil schooling was to pay it back at the Pentagon. And ultimately, there, Mark, I was ended up being the speechwriter to the Secretary of the Army.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, wild ride. I replaced a storied colonel, a guy named Colonel Red Adair. I remember going upstairs in the Pentagon, and he's looking at me like, I was a major, captain, promotable major. He looked at me like, "You're going to replace me?" I'm like, "I'm not trying to replace you. This is just where they sent me." He was on his way out the door, and I became the speechwriter to the Secretary of the Army.
Did you have any sort of speech writing experience at all?
I guess I was a good writer, and grad school was all about writing.
Yeah.
And so, I guess at the time they must have figured I could do it. Basically in the Army, you're put in a lot of situations and you're going to do your best. And grad school was good for me. I came out of that. They recognized it, and they liked the way I wrote. And at the end of the day, I did an interview with the Secretary of the Army, and he chose me as a speechwriter. So it was interesting. I never thought I'd be that guy either. That was not a life goal. But it was an interesting time because it was a time when we were expanding initially combat or military roles for military women. We were pushing into that world, advancing the cause of women in uniform. I was on the civilian side of the Army at that point, which was an interesting viewpoint.
You weren't wearing a uniform every day?
No, I did.
Okay.
I wore a uniform, but I worked for the Sec Army, who, big civilian over the United States Army, number one guy. And so it was an interesting vantage point to look at your Army from the lens of civilian control of the military, which people forget is how, our armed forces are organized. So it was an interesting kind of ride through that, but it wore my tail out over about 2 years. I volunteered to go to Korea, but, I did a year in Korea after that. I volunteered to go. There was another Patriot battalion there. I became the S3 and then XO. Came out on a 05 list while in Korea, a year in Korea, and got selected for battalion command. It was then as a battalion commander that I deployed my battalion to the Middle East when the first Gulf War was kind of still an open war, and we were still sending people to the Middle East. Now, we did 6-month rotations.
Okay, so where are you going, and what is obviously Patriots, for those who maybe too young in the audience to remember the Gulf War.
Yeah.
There were Scud missiles that were fired by Saddam and the Iraqi National Guard, and they were shot out of the sky by Patriot missiles. So
correct.
That was sort of how the whole war went. It was fought through the air. There wasn't a very large ground campaign, and when it was, Norman Schwarzkopf, may he rest in peace, rolled through the Iraqi army quicker than a hot knife through butter, and they surrendered like crazy. Right. And there are all these pictures of Iraqis with white flags and putting their hands behind their head and walking down in single file line, just giving up very quickly. So there wasn't a ground campaign, but the air campaign was quite the underscored major part of that first Gulf War conflict. So where are you going? What are you told about what your mission is?
Your listeners won't even remember this, but it was a very short war from a ground combat perspective. As you point out, long buildup, getting flowing forces in, building up logistics, building up all the combat power, and it was over in a hot minute. But at the end of the day, it persisted from an air and missile defense perspective because the strategic decision made by the country was to protect some key assets in the Middle East, oil fields, key centers of gravity. And to do that, we were deploying Patriot battalions on 6-month stints for years into the Middle East. So, that was a very real mission. We protected a lot of critical assets in the Middle East on behalf of our partners there. And we did it for years, up until the invasion of Iraq. I mean, Operation Southern Watch, Operation Northern Watch, these were, these were kind of operations that your listeners probably don't even think about every day, but those periods were filled with combat deployments of combat forces. We had prepositioned assets in theater that ground forces fell in on and exercised in the event that we were going to go back to war. And it was the same for the air and missile defense forces. We protected key air bases in Kuwait and beyond. So it was that kind of world. But then it all changed with 9/11.
Right.
It just all changed with 9/11. And at that moment, Mark, for your listeners, I'm sitting in the Army War College. First of all, I commanded a Patriot battalion and sent it into the Middle East and back. And I commanded that battalion for 2 years, came out of command, and I was selected for the War College. And so I went to Carlisle Barracks. And on 9/11, I'm sitting in the Army War College watching the Twin Towers fall, some 21 years ago now,
right,
as we speak, a week ago, 21 years. So, it got another hot minute. It just changed in an instant for all the War College class. And, we were off as we graduated from the War College and sent to combat. Basically, you joined combat units.
Before we get post 9/11, I just want to go back to one more question on the Gulf War. You had come in and you had all these grizzled Vietnam veterans who were there, who had seen combat, who were able to speak of that experience to you and give it to you. Now you're taking this Patriot battalion battery into combat. You don't have any of that experience. What are the conversations like that you're having with your troops prior to heading overseas?
Well, it was interesting because we had a lot of combat veterans from the first Gulf War. And so we lost our Vietnam veterans because of age. But at the end of the day, I had guys with right shoulder combat patches in my air defense battalion that we deployed with. So I had first sergeants. I had a great first sergeant, Ortiz. He had both Vietnam experience and Gulf War experience. So,
wow.
So I still had some old timers in the battalion that were pretty grizzled kind of veterans of not necessarily Vietnam to the extent it was in my early days, but the first Gulf War. They had deployed, in the first Gulf War during those combat operations, and those were part of my battalion for that deployment. So, but we had a lot of youngsters too. Like, it's the nature of the Army. You're always, introducing guys to what this culture is like. But the seasoned guys were very good we got very good at deployments, like railheading, airheading. We got very good at that stuff. And so it was not for us, SRP, getting ready to deploy, like it was part of the life. I think probably more so, Mark, than the rest of the Army, like who did JRTC and NTC.
Yeah.
We SRP'd, we got anthrax shots. We did everything like we were going in for real and staying there. And there were flare-ups during those periods where, Patriot was deployed in 72 hours back to the Middle East for stuff like that too. So the level of readiness in that formation was pretty substantial at all times. It really was.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's interesting because even on this show, we've had a hard time finding a ton of first Gulf War veterans, right? Like, there's just a very small number of them, and because the amount of combat direct combat was so small, there's not a lot of experiences to tell. No. And I assume as a Patriot battery, even though you were being fired at, what was your success rate at hitting Scud missiles coming in?
We were really good. But, it's an interesting point of the conversation because if you take my experience, after 9/11, one of my sister battalions in the brigade where I was a battalion commander was 552 ADA. This is the Jessica Lynch unit. The maintenance company in my sister battalion in my brigade. So when you look at what happened there in the early days of the invasion of Iraq, your point about not a lot of combat experience, I think actually came home to roost for my sister battalion. It made a wrong turn, ended up in a bad situation with a lot of inexperience and not a great way to get out of it. And I think, it was in that moment that I think, and your listeners might not even really understand this, but in the early days of that invasion, we were we were kind of viewed as being liberators again, like the first Gulf War.
Right.
Turned out not to be true. And so the hype over it was minimal resistance, and so that mentality, I think at the end of the day, and a lack of combat experience, hardened combat experience, it got real very quick for 518 maintenance company.
And interestingly enough, we interviewed the SRO, an earlier guest, Dave Young, on this podcast, who was with the members of the 502nd, that maintenance company. He and his co-pilot Ron Young were also captured along with them. They went down in a completely separate incident, but the Iraqis lumped them all together. So interesting story.
Yeah, the 507. I'm glad you had a guy on the show to talk about that.
Yeah,
because it was. I don't think people really. Well, it was. Look, it was popularized, right? There's popular lore.
It was also bastardized, the extent of the truth of what actually happened, which is what the media is wont to do. But
correct.
Now you know better.
Yeah, exactly. So back to your question though, the combat experience was different. It was from this generation, and it was helpful because people had been there and done it before.
I want to ask you because again, the initial invasion of Iraq, which was your second deployment there, and you talk about the sort of lack of experience. During the invasion, there were several accounts of friendly fire incidents that went on between air power and ground power, and some of them ended badly for us. Again, it's not to point fingers. I mean, sometimes it's for lack of a better way to phrase it, I don't want to call it a necessary evil, but it is part of the collateral damage of combat at times. I was just curious with you guys as a Patriot battery, did you, not that did you experience anything like that, but do you, when you see the inexperience of combat and your soldiers having it, how confusing was it for you guys to understand, comparatively speaking, to the first Gulf War?
Yeah, so exponentially is the short answer, because first of all, for my second deployment, I was the G3 current ops guy for the Combined Forces Land Component Commander, General Dave Kiernan, and for the initial invasion. So in essence, I controlled all the Patriot fires for the initial 7 months of the war. That's what I did for the Land Component Commander. And so your point about friendly, I experienced it, Mark. Like I lived it. Like, mistakes are made. It's a very complex operating environment where a lot of variables are in play and nothing is perfect. And so, there were two friendly fire incidents on my watch. One involved a returning aircraft to base that was from a coalition forces country. The pilots had left on their jamming pod, returning to base, gets tagged as a hostile aircraft, and bad things happen. And so that was friendly fire incident number one. And a second one was a U.S. naval aircraft that was mistakenly shot down on one night during the invasion as well. So I witnessed all of that, unfortunately, and it's just so freaking complicated, the operating environment when you're dealing with all this from the perspective that I held, and in that there's human beings and they make mistakes and there are consequences, as unfortunate as they are. And it was just it sucked. It sucked to be part of that. Whereas we shot down plenty of enemy ballistic missiles and no one suffered any harm from any Scud missile strikes, during the invasion of Iraq in that initial period. Mistakes were made in the ground to air mode with aircraft. And so it sucked, Mark. It really sucked. There were bad things that happened then. So.
Yeah, I mean, hey, war is hell, right?
You don't know what to make of it until you're stuck with it, and then it just kind of, I don't even know how to describe it because it just, you can't believe you were a part of something like that. You feel horrible. I mean, to this day, you feel horrible for stuff like that. So
yeah, and even though none of it is intentional, there's no desire to do something like that. The effects of it are lasting, to say the least, and it should go a lot further than, oh well, that was a mistake. I mean, there is a certain level of accountability that we want to have for those things, but the fog of war is real, man. It's not,
Well, that's the phrase.
Unfortunately, it takes practice to get better at understanding the fog of war. And the downside of that is you don't always get through the first time.
No,
it's not something you can practice a lot at.
Life and death consequences to bad things. So that's for sure.
Right. After that deployment ends in 2003, right? It's you're there for what, 6-7 months?
7 months. Yeah.
Okay. Are you feeling like you had done enough at this point in time, as far as in uniform?
Yeah. I glossed over this, but in the run up to the deployment, my parents were divorced. My mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I should point out for your listeners, both my brother and I were serving Army colonels at the time of the diagnosis. Wow. He's an EOD guy. My brother also was an Army colonel, retired, but he's an EOD guy. Along the way of the run up to that and that deployment, my mom gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I come home and just recognize that my brother and I had done the best we could to take care of her while we were both serving our country, but she was all alone. So I made a decision that essentially, just like you said, like, okay, I've given it a good run. I was, 23 years, 24 years in service at that point. I was like, I got to take care of my mother, like, because my brother was 3 years behind me, still pushing hard. And so he and I talked, and the decision was like, okay, I'm going to retire. Like, I'm going to retire. And I'm going to go home to upstate New York and figure it out and take care of my mom. I grew up single parent, so she did her best to take care of me, saw me go in the Army, loved my Army career, was a little bit pay it back. So, and also I'll point out, like, life gets hard the further you get up in there. Like, and I should say this, like, I didn't really have any aspirations of being beyond an Army colonel. So I felt like that was kind of a cool rank to punch out at. I felt like it was still connected to ground truth. You weren't caught up.
You're connected to ground truth, but the pull is hard, man.
Yeah, it is.
But I didn't feel it. It pulls hard at you. I speak to personal experience right now. It's a hard pull.
Yeah, it is. But I guess I didn't want to be those guys. Like, you know what I mean? I didn't want to be those guys.
You know what it is? Like, here's the best analogy I can think of. Have you seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade?
Yes.
Okay, at the very end, when the earth splits because they take the Grail past the seal, and Indiana slips and falls, and he's reaching for the Grail, and it's right there, and he's like, I can almost get it, Dad, I can almost get it. And his father looks at him and says, Indiana, let it go. And if somebody isn't there saying to you, let it go, you're really trying to grab for that Grail, man. And that Grail is that flag with a star on it that pulls you really hard in that direction. And hearing the words let it go are an internal struggle that I live with currently every day.
Yeah, I can talk about that because there are certain aspects of my life that I regret that decision a little bit. But I think in the moment, I will tell you, like, what happened to me was I came back from the war. I was in the queue for brigade command consideration, and I did the right thing. I told the Army I wasn't interested. So I literally removed myself from consideration for brigade command. And I had been advised that if you're going to do this, you do it now, not after you get selected and walk away, because that's bullshit. So I was respected for the decision, and the Army respected me for it, and they understood the situation with my mom. And I ended up assigned to West in teaching ethics in the Simon Center for professional military ethics. So it got me back to New York, allowed me to exit stage right and go on into the next chapter of my life. But looking back on it, my mom was one draw that was stronger than the draw to, go forward and reach for that flag. I honestly, Mark, I just I've seen a lot of general officers, and I really didn't think that was my life. That was not where I wanted to be. I was still pretty young. I wanted to, kick ass and take names in a second chapter of my life. And I felt like I was going out on a high note. I did everything I wanted to do, and I was quite comfortable, and the chance to take care of my mom at the same time. So the pull was there. And every time I get pissed off, I regret an aspect of the decision, but it's short lived. It doesn't bother me to this day.
No, I mean, again, I'm still in uniform. I'm an 06, and I feel.
You know what I'm talking about.
I feel that it's one of those things where, first of all, the only way you get behind the velvet ropes is if the people behind the velvet ropes let you in, which is
they invite you in,
which is a weird thing because it's not about your aptitude, your competency, your ratings, or whatever you've gotten. It's about whether they feel you're sort of general officer material.
Yeah, that selection board. That's right.
And that is a slippery slope to stand on. There's a part of me that wants to go for it because of that whole ideology that I don't like, that it shouldn't be about whether you think I'm general officer material. It should be about what I've accomplished, what I've done, and everything else. And so there's a certain component of personality that I feel sort of eliminates me from that whole group. And I've had this conversation with other 06s, and I fully admit I don't play the game very well. I'm too forthright, I'm too direct, I'm too blunt, I'm too honest, and when I disagree and I believe you're wrong, I will tell you to your face I believe you're wrong. And that doesn't always go over well with certain people. Because when you get in an insular circle of all people who think the same, for somebody to invade that circle and tell them that you're wrong is met with a lot of resistance.
Yeah. I guess I didn't like the trappings aspect of it. I have friends who are retired GOs, and when the day comes when somebody else is putting your ribbons together.
I'm with you on that. I don't want it. I never wanted it for that. I want it because I want the chance to lead at the highest level. Yeah. Right. That's the draw for me. That's what's, the hard part is to be able to, be that close to, and you take this notion of a ground commander, right? Where you, as a company commander, because, I had a friend tell me that captain and colonel are the only two cool ranks on the officer.
I think that's true.
They're the coolest ranks. Everything else is a waste, but captain as a company commander and a colonel are the two coolest ranks. You have this sort of idealistic notion that you can take that captain ideology of affecting things at the ground level and apply it when you're a GO and it's going to work.
Yeah.
But there's a huge gap between that ideology and what can actually go on the ground. And you start to realize as you become an 06, the other things that all pull out you from the outside and the other detractors and everything else. And all of a sudden you're solving strategic level problems and affecting the things where the rubber meets the road becomes near impossibility because you'll fail at the job in front of you.
Yeah. No, it's you just nailed it. And I do believe those two ranks were my favorite ranks. I'll be honest with you, just like you probably. It's where you get the most enjoyment because you're just really connected to soldiering. I can't say it any other way. Even at that battalion commander level, that's really a lot of fun. You're pushing all the right things. And it reminds you of being a captain because you pushed all the right things as a captain.
Yeah, the difference is nobody wants to hang around the 05. I realized that the day I took battalion command and I looked around and everybody left the room when I walked in. I'm like, what the hell? What do I do? Do I smell? Do I need a shower? Where'd everybody go? Because nobody wants to hang around the commander. Nobody wants to hang around the 05. They'll hang around the company commander, but they won't hang around the 05 commander.
Well, they tell you that. The further up you go, the lonelier it gets.
Yes.
That's the isolation of senior level command is a very real thing. Yeah. And so, I don't know. I was wired to I'm going to say this word, for me, I just always thought of a colonel as respect. And then everything beyond that was just this world of polish and other things. And so somewhat disconnected, you get a phone call from a general's aide, the general would like to run with your unit. Well, he can come down and run anytime he wants. I don't need a phone call. Like, so when you think about it in those terms, like somebody's going to call some poor battalion commander and say, he'd like to run with you today. Like, just show up.
And then have everybody piss up and down their leg about, all the protocol and everything else. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's
like,
silly.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
now that every former NCO listening to this has vomited 7 times over because they don't give a rip.
Exactly.
I apologize to those members of our audience in the NCO Corps. Because you guys don't care. But it's a little peeling back of the curtain, at least how not so general officers think. How's that sound? All right. So you're on your way out the door. Do you know what you want to do? Hey, doggy. Do you know what you want to do? It's okay, dog. Listen.
Hold on, Mark.
We have friends here. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Do you know what you want to do in post-military career at this point?
Again, like my life story, not really. So, my wife at the time, Mark, I remember this very clearly in the war college, asked me one question in the kitchen. What are you going to do when you grow up? Swear to God. Swear to God. Like, because I was a man child in the United States Army. That's how the best way I can describe it. I just loved it that much. She asked me that question. I didn't have an answer. And she goes, well, I have an answer. We're going home. And because we've been kicking around for 26 years, I've been following you around, done everything you wanted us to do. And I want to go home and be near my family. So we did that. And I had no job. I transitioned out, separated, retired from West Point, moved north to upstate New York with no job, and just started figuring it out. So I'm one of those guys, like, no life plan. I didn't have like, I'd like to be this.
Short question. Nope. What did you figure out then?
I figured out that I had a lot of strengths that I didn't necessarily recognize that the rest of the world didn't. And I started parlaying those strengths, and those strengths were leadership. And I started old school. First job I ever applied for was on USA Jobs. Got the job, lasted about 90 days because the ethical morass that I ended up walking into was just so freaking bad. It wasn't funny. And then I just started figuring things out from there. I became a little bit known to people. They suggested this. When I turned away from that first civilian opportunity, I had come across the idea that some people asked me if I wanted to serve in state government because of my leadership experience. So at first I said no. And then I said, I'll think about it. And I actually became the Commissioner of Veterans Services for New York State shortly thereafter. And I did that for 3 years under then Governor Spitzer. We all remember him.
Short-lived.
Yeah, it was there that I left to go to Veterans Outreach Center. I had done my tour of duty in another public sector, leadership opportunity. And you just meet people along the way and they present opportunities. And if you're smart enough to kind of go for them, things happen, which is what I did.
What was it about being back in the veteran space that attracted you to it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it very simply. The ability to continue taking care of people.
Right.
Like, that's it. I mean, I thought about this in advance of this podcast. Like, I've been very fortunate since the day I took off the uniform. I've done nothing but continue to serve people who served in our armed forces and their family members. And for me, that's like very special. Like, and it's not something I take for granted. And I realize I'm pretty lucky to have the trajectory I've had to do that. But for me, it was make a difference in people's lives who had served their country. So it was no different than being in uniform as far as I was concerned. It was culturally a fit. It was admirable. It was noble. It had honor with it. It had dignity with it. And I was around people who were a lot like me. So, yeah, it was all that.
So you had worked for the state. You worked for Veterans Outreach Center, which is not a non-state entity. It's a civilian corporation. You go back to work for the state again after that. What are you noticing the differences between state-level veterans operations and non-state level / governmental veterans operations? What's the biggest difference you're finding?
Well, I think the silos in which they both operate, like they're the cross-pollination between government and private sector when it comes to taking care of people who served in our armed forces and their families is shallow. That pool doesn't have much water in it. There's just not a lot there where I think as much as listeners would like to think that this is all organized and coordinated between the federal government, the states, and the private sector and the nonprofit communities that serve people, it's not. It takes a lot of work to bring synchronization about. And so I guess the biggest thing I realized was like, well, this sucks. These things aren't really working well together. Why is that? Like, and truthfully, the muscle tissue isn't there between these sectors of our our American economy and culture. States do what states do. Federal government does what federal government does. Nonprofits do what nonprofits do. And it's not great connective tissue kind of threading between those paths. And if it were, things would be a lot better. And I guess the biggest disconnect I saw was between the federal government and the states. In the states, there was a great deal more flexibility to innovate. Federal government, not so. Big behemoth. And so I guess I was disappointed in the lack of coordination between the federal government and our states. And then I was disappointed to see that transcend into the communities in which we live and work. So, yeah.
I mean, it's pretty fair to say that at least in my adult lifetime, and I don't know what it was post-Vietnam, I was too young, but there has never been a more universally accepted desire for a solution to a problem than there has been for veterans, both in the government and in private sector, yet that has more resources devoted to it that solves absolutely nothing than the crisis surrounding taking care of veterans. It is actually laughable at this point in time. And when I hear politicians campaign on fixing veteran this and fixing veteran that, I'm literally looking at you going, you're a liar. Because you can't solve this problem. If it hasn't been solved yet, when universally everybody agrees that this is something that requires attention and we haven't figured it out, you alone are not going to change anything with this. Now, that doesn't mean you can't win small battles at small levels and affect things positively for a small amount of people, and I advocate for that. Hell, I went to war in Iraq twice. That's all you could ever do was win small battles in small areas and advocate, because strategically it was never going to be what we wanted it to be. That said, no, by the way, a different conversation for a different day, but that said, I'm all for that. But, to your point is simply that the disconnect, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing on so many different occasions when it comes to veterans, both in the private sector, in the government sector, in every size, way, shape, or form. We've expounded and expended so much energy and dollars on a problem to genuinely not fix it at any holistic level whatsoever. And I don't know if in my adult lifetime it ever will be fixed. I'm still personally fighting. I'm still personally fighting VA bureaucracy.
Yeah, certainly to your point, there has been incremental progress made around the edges, right? Yes. There's things that get better. Transition is better today from the United States Army than it was when I transitioned, right? There's all those little like upticks and things getting better. But holistically speaking, like this whole of nation kind of effort that should serve to underpin the moral obligation to retain a ready armed forces and what it does after its service, it's not there. It's piecemeal. It's a checkerboard square of items, like and the moves that we make across that checkerboard, they're episodic, they're transactional. I guess the failure is not to really present a concerted whole of nation effort that reinforces the value of military service from a post-military service perspective, that your service was respected, it's highly regarded, and we're going to do the things this way because of that. It's not what it's about, Mark. It's not.
I could argue that there should be a whole division within not the government, but the military itself to correct these problems before they walk out the door, right? Yeah. Before you drive the car off the lot, make sure it runs correctly, right? You don't take the car off and then ask to go back to the dealership and say, fix this.
Yeah.
Before you leave the lot, the car is supposed to work. Before the individual leaves the military, they're supposed to work. and they're supposed to stay within the military constraints to fix everything until they're officially done, which is what we do in a small aspect because we have these WTUs, these warrior transition units for people who are broken before they leave active duty after combat, and yet we haven't figured out how to grand scale that for everybody.
Yeah. Listen,
the frustration is palpable.
With the CEO of the Warrior Transition Battalion at Camp Pendleton, and spot on. Like we're transitioning a lot of people with a lot of issues, and some of them did not originate in service. Some originated before service, exacerbated through service, but ultimately we all end up out here where I am now in a community, and so there's, and in my line of work now in Headstrong, we see all of that up close and personal. Like every day, we deal with human failure and problems on a daily basis, and so it's almost like being like, I feel like I'm a catcher on a baseball team. Like it's just like every pitch that some genius wants to throw is hopefully going to land in our glove, and we're going to be able to take care of that. Like and it just like, but we're one solution. We have a lot of, we punch above our weight for what we do every day, but there's much more out there than that we're missing. It's just not there.
Yeah. So. Again, going around the block to get next door to fix a problem.
Exactly.
It's very much frustrating, but that's not what we're here to talk about. So you mentioned Headstrong. How do you end up there? And what was the big attraction to going to Headstrong after working for, the state of New York and other institutions?
Well, short answer was the guy I was working for was Governor Andrew Cuomo. So that'll give your listeners like some insight as to what that was about.
As a native New Yorker, I'll hold my tongue on this one.
Yeah, exactly. So at the end of the day, I worked for Governor Cuomo for a year, and for me, the return to government was all about because they had no director for years, and I saw I was at a point in my life. The good thing about people like us is you can kind of do what you choose to do at this point in your life, which is my life story, choosing to do what I want to do. So I went back into government to kind of help them out. So Headstrong, I've known the founder, Zach Iskel, for a long time. Yep. When he first built Headstrong in 2012, I knew Zach then. The ED, Joe Quinn, happened to be
very good friend of mine.
Yep. Your listeners, you may not even know.
Previous guest, by the way, as well. Joe told his story right here.
Joe's a great guy. So what people
unfortunately, he's a Met fan, but I don't hold that against him.
Yeah. But Joe and I had a relationship before Headstrong, and it was at West Point. The year I was there, young Joe Quinn and I happened to run into one another at the Simon Center for Professional Military Ethics. So got to know Joe Quinn as a West Point cadet about to graduate and go to the Army. So he quit being the ED, went into the hot dog business, as I'm sure his story has been told.
Quite delicious, Feltman's hot dogs.
Yeah.
Little plug there.
Brand.
And their mustard is off. If you like spicy mustard, off the charts.
It's off the charts.
Off the charts, good.
Joe's a great guy. So, Joe sent me a note that he was leaving, and I sent him a note back. He's like, hey, this is unheard of, but I wouldn't mind replacing you. Here's a retired 06 replacing a former captain. Like it's uncanny. Nobody does it. And I was like, well, here's the deal. I wanted to get to a point in my life where I knew what I was doing was positively impacting people's lives in ways that we could demonstrate it. There's a lot of anecdotes about what works, what doesn't, this, that, the other thing. There's a lot of shiny objects. I kind of was getting tired of the anecdote-based approach to addressing the needs of veterans. So the science behind Headstrong is, evidence-based mental health treatment. So there's science behind it. So for me, the gig was my opportunity to do something I had never done before and get involved in the hard science of improving people's lives from a clinical perspective. Something I actually wanted to do in my life was to join a team whose mission that was. So Joe left. I approached Zach, told him I wanted to lead it in about a hot 2-week period. I was selected as the chief executive officer, and I've been here in my third year. So for me, it's something I wanted to do. No life plan, but I really love the organization. I knew it from 2012. I had sent guys into Headstrong to be cared for. They were pleased with the results, so I knew it from the inside out. And another leadership opportunity emerged, and I wanted it, and so I went after it and got it. So
that's awesome. I mean, again, it is a phenomenal organization, and the stories that they've told, and we've had several Headstrong folks on the show here that have really, made incredible strides in their own personal lives, and getting better every day. And I was telling somebody the other day, it's anything when it comes to mental health from a military standpoint. I assume it's similar for everybody else, but I feel like we are never at a destination with it, because combat does so many things to you that the masses don't understand, and from that standpoint, you're just on a journey with it, and learning how to live with it and operate with it. And again, I'm not casting any aspersions on other mental health issues, but personally, through my own journey and everything that I've gone through, it's learning to adjust to life differently because of what you've been through is a key component of survival in a post-combat world, from a mental health standpoint. Yeah,
Mark, in many ways, what I've realized Headstrong's value is that it helps you maintain what you just said, your life's journey, and it's always there. People can come back into treatment, and life changes for people. It's changed for me. I'm sure it's changed for you. The ability to kind of tap into something such as Headstrong is really it's unequaled. Like the idea that you can be there for someone, when they need you to be there, help them get well. Something changes, they can come back. Like for me, there's a little bit of this that teaches me, like, its real value in the world is that it's there for people when they need it. Like it's like that I've come to learn from the inside out. Like, honest to God, like that's it.
What or without names, obviously, just what are some of the stories of some of the people that in your time at Headstrong have really stuck out to you that you're like, this is why I get out of bed every day. These are the people, these are the stories that we create that really solidify my whole existence in this organization.
Well, I think the immediate one that comes to mind is when you have someone who takes their own life while in treatment. I remember, it happens. There's no perfect score here. Like it, and it.
Yeah, that's a great way to phrase it. Yeah.
There is no perfect game, and when someone makes a decision to end their own life, the impact on this organization is one that makes me double down on trying my best to ensure someone else doesn't do that. Like it's, and I've been leading this place in my third year. It's happened to me twice since I've been here. And it just kind of does to me, like I get pissed, to be honest. Like I'm trying to figure out what did we miss? And then you realize you just did your best, and sometimes it's just not good enough in what people are facing in their lives. And so I think for me, Mark, it's like the stories that resonate most are the stories of failure, because it as if I needed to reignite my passion any more than it already is. Like it just makes me kind of just dig in and recognize that above all else, I'm going to build an even better organization that does more for more people in the right way. And so those stories hurt, and they just make me.
Is it one of those things where, as they happen, unfortunately, the frequency at which they happen, you have to grow more numb to it, or do you still take it as personal now as you did?
It's personal. I'm not numb to any of it. I'm not immune to any of it. One of my best friends in the Army died by suicide. I don't become numb. I become a little bit enraged that I haven't done good enough by these people. And so I guess for me, numbness isn't an option. It's not, because I'm running an organization whose mission is to keep people alive. That's at the end of the day, we're putting all into making sure people live today. And so there's no room for numbness. You gotta grow this thing. You got to get more clinicians. You got to get more people into care. You just got to do the right thing to get people, because I know the secret of this place, and I know the goodness that it is. And you only know that if you're in it, or if you've ever touched it in your life. You know how different Headstrong is from anything else you've ever done. And so I get charged up. No, the numbness is not an option.
One of the things it says on the website, which is theheadstrongproject.org, triumph over trauma, cost-free, barrier-free, stigma-free mental health care treatment. I get the cost-free and the barrier-free. When you say stigma-free, why is that important to denote?
Well, because I think it's the number one barrier to care is the stigma of asking for help, right? So if the response is like our response, we don't care where you served, when you served, how you served. Like we're not going to judge your military service. We could care less. The fact is, there's something going on in your life. You experienced some trauma, and fortunately for us, we've got world-class clinicians who know how to treat trauma. So the first step is to create a relationship with the individual, and if they're afraid to reach out and ask for help, you've got to ensure that the response is one that doesn't question the ask for help. So there's this face of the organization that recognizes that stigma is very real. And when people finally get to the point of asking for help because their lives are broken and they just can't do it anymore, you got to just embrace that. And so you do it a couple of different ways, Mark. One is you make sure that your clinicians are really experienced in the culture of the individuals turning to them for help. There's a lot said about cultural competency in the world today. It comes in many ways, shapes, and forms. Foremost for us, it's the ability to understand the military experience from any perspective: actively serving member, Guard, Reserve, family member, veteran, but just to understand what it meant to be that person, those people, what those experiences were like. So there's a relatability that you have to really get to quickly. And it begins with understanding the journey of the people who are asking for help. So I think that's one way we actively try to reduce the stigma of asking for help in the first place. And so it's a very real thing, and we go to great lengths to do it.
What is, outside of, the help of helping veterans themselves, what is the reward for this job for you?
It's on a couple of levels, Mark. One is developing the team. I go back to, I really love working with people of all walks of life. Reminds me of the Army. You come from everywhere. Yeah. You inherit a team, and then as the guy running it, your number one job is to develop that team, make it become everything that it can be, and that starts with people. So my goal is for people on this team is to make them feel like they're part of a family that gives a crap in where they're going in their life and underwrites their mistakes and values their performance and pushes them in a way that they become enriched in the practice of what we do. And so for me, what's professionally rewarding is to see people around me flourish, and have the hand that on the stick that kind of guides that along, right? So that's number one. Number two is people get well. Exiting people from treatment is actually a good thing. It means they're ready to go. They're ready to go. And so every day when I can open the door for someone new and take care of someone and send them on their way, for me, it's professionally enriching. So I guess all that kind of is best summarized is you get to a point in your life when you realize, like I realized in the Army and throughout the course of my life, that I do exist for other people. That's who I am. Like that comes at the expense of things like family and stuff like that along the way. There can be friction points like that. But for me, my professional identity is wrapped up in the fact that I'm here for other people. And that extends to staff, teammates, our clinicians, and then all the way to clients. And so I don't need much more beyond that. I really don't. Like for me, that's what it's about.
You spent 26 years in uniform. And I said this several times throughout the show. Would you argue that what you're doing now is more important than any day you served in uniform?
Yeah, I would, because I talked about life or death consequences.
Yeah.
Every day of my life here in Headstrong, there are life and death consequences to what we do. And it's a full-time job versus a part-time experience, in the Army where that occurred. There's no downtime in this organization. There's, you're 365, 18 hours a day because you want to be. And so I think for me, I recognize the value of my military service as bringing me to this point in life where, because of that experience, it's valuable in leading an organization like this and caring for the people that the organization holds dear. And I guess to answer the question, I feel like this is even more important because this is truly the people side of everything. Like it just is.
What's kind of a message, to veterans or service members out there who are even thinking about getting help or feel like they need or want to get help? How do you reach them?
Yeah, look, I'm always asked this question, and you have to be ready. You're going to get to a point where everything you tried stopped working, and you're going to have to take that step. Like you're going to have to step out of your comfort zone when the time comes to ask for help. And the good news about it is that, if Headstrong ends up being a place where you ask for help, you're going to get help. And so I think I guess I understand the dilemma we confront in this country. And the reason this is so difficult is that a lot of people are not ready to ask for help, and they just suffer needlessly because they can't crack that code that allows them to kind of step across that line with the understanding that I'm not going to be judged for it. I'm not going to be questioned for it. I just, I'm out here flapping and I need help. And so, my message to everyone is and it's overused and it's, everybody tries to say the same thing, but I guess I'll say it a different way. Until you reach that line, I get where you're coming from. I've been there. I was afraid. I hit a point in my life, experienced failure, and I was afraid to cross that line to get back up on my feet. And I can tell you in hindsight that making the decision to start it up was the decision that changed my life. It's that simple. But until you get there, Mark, I feel for you. If I'm talking directly to your listeners, if you're at a point where you're not there yet, work harder to get there. This is work. Yeah. Life is work. There's not a bunch of gifts all the time.
The other thing I would add, and I speak to this from my own experience about not being ready. Military people tend to compartmentalize very well, right?
We do it so well.
And because we're trained to do it. This goes in this box, this goes in this box, this goes in this box. And what you don't realize is all those little boxes sit in one big box. And until you unpack them all inside the big box, you don't know what's connected and what isn't. And that was the struggle for me. I never put together certain behaviors were a result of things that I had been through because they had come so second nature to me. And until somebody, and the truth be told, doing this podcast was a major factor in me recognizing that because I listened to so many other people say it to me. Yeah. And having conversations with them after recording and via text and everything else, they would say, hey, Mark, maybe you should Go explore this a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
And so you don't realize that a lot of these things are connected. And maybe that's why you feel like you're not ready or you don't need to be ready.
But so much goes into like training us to be tough.
Yeah.
And, it's a whole thing, right? It's the culture of where we were. Like leadership is designed to be tough, and you're designed to be tough. And then all of a sudden, like that tough angle, it's not working for me. Like, I'm not doing so well. There's something here that, I just don't feel like tough is like where I am. Like I'm weak. There's something wrong here. And so it takes a lot to kind of turn away from that persona that you've become.
Yeah.
And so I guess like for listeners, like it's who we are, but we all at times end up here is my sense of the world today now, Mark, is that I'm not unique. You're probably not that unique either. Like universally, people like us at some point in our lives, it's okay. We're going to need some help occasionally. So, and I didn't think I would. You probably didn't think you would either.
No. I mean,
Yeah.
For the record, my mom told me I was special when I was young, and I believed it ever since. So I'm holding to that, and I'm taking it.
Yeah, I went to Catholic school. It didn't work that way.
so same here. I had a couple of priests who told me otherwise, but
exactly.
I was sticking with what Mom said. And I'll take that to my grave with me. But we kid. Again, theheadstrongproject.org, where to go if you guys have any questions or just want to at least explore the idea of getting some help. This is a fantastic organization, guys. I can't endorse it enough. And the people who work there, they are all just fantastic human beings who have dedicated the rest of their lives to improving the lives of those who need it in the veteran space. So please check it out, the headstrongproject.org. Jim, thank you so much. It's amazing to talk to you. It's great to get to know you one-on-one. I've watched your work from afar, and I'm excited and glad that you were able to jump on with us and share some of your story and what you're doing now, because obviously, again, I hold it in a very, very high regard, and certainly any way I can help Headstrong out, please let me know in the future. I'd love to be part of anything that you guys need. So I can't thank you enough for today.
Mark, thank you. It's really nice, getting a chance to kind of tell a story in front of your listeners and work with you along the way. So respect you deeply and want to say thanks for everything, and let's stay in touch, brother. Okay?
Absolutely. Jim McDonough, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
All right, Mark. Take care.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.